What happens when a teacher's attempt to humiliate a student backfires in the most brilliant way? Let's dive into this unforgettable moment at Sylview Middle School in Cleveland, Ohio. The buzz of middle school chatter filled the air as students filed into room 207. Math class was often a drag for most seventh graders, and today seemed no different, except for one girl seated quietly near the back. Her name was Alyssa. At just 12 years old, she had already mastered the art of blending into the background, a skill born out of years of being overlooked. Alyssa was the kind of student most teachers barely noticed. She rarely spoke unless called on, turned in her homework on time, and avoided attention like it was her life's mission. But there was something about her that made her different, even if no one had noticed yet. Her notebooks, for example, were filled with not just class notes, but advanced math problems, far beyond her grade level, solved meticulously in the margins. It was her little secret. Her teacher, Mrs. Grant, was the complete opposite. Known for her sharp tongue and unyielding standards, she had no patience for mediocrity. At 42, she was a seasoned educator who believed in tough love and didn't shy away from calling students out when she thought they were slacking. Some students feared her, others admired her no-nonsense demeanor. But today, frustration was etched across her face as she scanned the rows of slumped shoulders and blank stares. "This," she said, holding up a worksheet, "is basic algebra." Basic, and yet half of you can't even figure it out. Her voice carried the kind of edge that silenced side conversations instantly. "I've been teaching this unit for weeks, and still, nothing." She slapped the paper onto her desk with a sigh that seemed to echo through the room. "What is it going to take to get you all to care?" Alyssa kept her eyes fixed on her notebook, pretending to review her work. She wasn't scared of Mrs. Grant, not really, but she hated being the center of attention. She'd perfected the art of invisibility, and it had served her well so far. But today, her carefully constructed bubble of anonymity was about to burst. Mrs. Grant paced at the front of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. "You're going to see questions like these on every test from now until college, and if you don't understand them now, you're setting yourselves up for failure." Her gaze swept the classroom, lingering on each student for just a second longer than was comfortable. Then her eyes landed on Alyssa. "Miss Daniels," Mrs. Grant said, her voice slicing through the silence. Alyssa's head snapped up in surprise, her stomach tightening. "You've been awfully quiet back there. Let's see if you've been paying attention." Alyssa's cheeks burned as the entire class turned to look at her. She wanted to melt into her seat, to disappear, but there was no escape. She forced herself to nod, her voice barely audible. "Yes, ma'am." But Mrs. Grant wasn't done. She walked over to the board, grabbed a piece of chalk, and began scribbling furiously. The equation she wrote stretched across the board, a labyrinth of variables and exponents that looked like something out of a college textbook. Gasps and low murmurs rippled through the room as the students realized how absurdly difficult it was. The equation might as well have been written in another language for most of them. But Mrs. Grant wasn't looking for volunteers. She turned to Alyssa with a raised eyebrow and gestured to the board. "Solve it." Alyssa didn't move, at least not at first. The weight of the room's attention bore down on her, and the challenge hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The room felt electric, every student watching Alyssa with a mix of curiosity and relief that they weren't in her position. Whispers rippled through the class, just loud enough for her to catch snippets. "No way she can do that!" "What even is that?" And of course, a muffled laugh or two. Alyssa gripped her pencil tighter, her knuckles turning white. Her mind raced, not with panic, but with the instinctive calculations she'd been doing in secret for as long as she could remember. "Any time now?" Mrs. Grant said, crossing her arms and leaning against her desk. Her tone was laced with impatience, her smirk suggesting she didn't expect Alyssa to even try. "Or do you need a calculator?" The sarcasm drew a round of chuckles from the class, but Alyssa barely noticed. Her focus was narrowing, her thoughts aligning like pieces of a puzzle. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping the floor. It wasn't confidence that pushed her forward, but something quieter, something stronger, a determination that had been simmering just beneath the surface. She stepped to the front of the class, her sneakers scuffing against the tiles, and reached for the chalk. It felt cold in her hand, but she didn't hesitate. The room went silent save for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Alyssa's eyes scanned the equation, her brain working at a speed that would have astonished anyone watching. Variables danced in her mind, each one clicking into place like gears in a finely tuned machine. She raised the chalk and started writing. At first, the class didn't know how to react. The initial letters and numbers she scrawled on the board seemed random, disconnected. But then, as more symbols filled the space, a pattern began to emerge. Alyssa's movements were deliberate, her strokes steady. She wasn't just solving the problem, she was untangling it, breaking it down into manageable pieces that fit together perfectly. Mrs. Grant's smirk began to fade. She stepped closer to the board, her arms unfolding, as if seeing the equation anew through Alyssa's eyes. The room was so quiet now that the sound of the chalk against the board was almost deafening. By the time Alyssa reached the halfway point, the whispers had stopped. The class watched in stunned silence, their eyes darting between the board and Alyssa's face. She was calm, her expression focused, but not strained. It was as if she had done this 100 times before, because in some ways she had. Her nights spent scribbling equations into the margins of her notebooks, her weekends flipping through college-level math books she'd found at the library. All of it had led to this moment. Mrs. Grant cleared her throat, trying to regain her composure. "That's interesting," she muttered, but the wavering in her voice betrayed her surprise. Alyssa didn't respond. She didn't even look up. She was in her own world now, a place where the challenge wasn't daunting, but exhilarating. The final stretch of the equation required multiple steps, each one more complex than the last. Alyssa paused for a moment, not because she was unsure, but because she was double-checking her work. Then, with a few swift movements, she wrote the final answer, circled it, and stepped back. The board was filled with her handwriting, a maze of numbers and symbols that somehow made perfect sense. She turned to face the class, her hands dusty with chalk, her breathing steady. Mrs. Grant stood frozen for a moment, her eyes darting over the board. She traced the equation with her finger, muttering under her breath as she checked Alyssa's work. Finally, she stepped back, her expression unreadable. But the silence that followed wasn't just from the teacher, it was from the class too, as they processed what they had just witnessed. Alyssa stood at the front of the room, her chalk-stained hands hanging loosely by her sides. Her heart thudded in her chest, but her face betrayed none of it. She scanned the room briefly, catching glimpses of wide eyes and slack jaws. No one was laughing anymore. Mrs. Grant remained by the board, her gaze fixed on the solution Alyssa had just written. Her finger traced each line, occasionally pausing as if searching for an error. But there was none. The silence stretched, heavy and unbroken, until she finally turned to face Alyssa. "How?" Mrs. Grant began, her voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. She stopped herself, shaking her head slightly, as if trying to process what had just happened. "How did you know to do that?" Alyssa shifted on her feet. She didn't like the spotlight, but she also wasn't about to dismiss what she'd just accomplished. "I've been studying," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It made sense once I broke it down." Mrs. Grant stared at her, a flicker of disbelief still lingering in her eyes. "Studying? On your own?" Alyssa nodded. "I like math." A ripple of murmurs spread through the classroom. Some students exchanged glances. Others whispered behind cupped hands. No one had expected this. Not from Alyssa, the girl who always seemed to disappear into the background. But it wasn't just the students who were struggling to make sense of the moment. Mrs. Grant, a teacher who prided herself on recognizing potential, realized she had missed something extraordinary. She had underestimated a child whose brilliance had been hiding in plain sight. Clearing her throat, Mrs. Grant gestured toward the board. "Class, let's take a moment to appreciate what just happened here." Alyssa not only solved this problem, she did it in a way that demonstrates a level of understanding far beyond what's expected at her age. Her words were measured, but there was a hint of awe in her tone. This is what true talent looks like. Alyssa's cheeks flushed at the unexpected praise. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, let alone being celebrated. She glanced back at her seat, longing to retreat to the safety of her desk. But something stopped her. For the first time, she felt a flicker of pride, not because she had proven Mrs. Grant wrong, but because she had proven herself right. The class, still stunned, began to clap. It started slowly, a smattering of applause from a few students in the back, but it grew louder, more confident. Alyssa looked out at her peers, her usually shy demeanor giving way to a small, tentative smile. She hadn't just solved an equation, she had shifted the dynamic of the entire room. Mrs. Grant raised her hand to quiet the applause, her expression thoughtful. "Alyssa," she said, her voice firm but kind, "why didn't you ever speak up before? If you can do this, why haven't you shown it?" Alyssa hesitated. She wasn't sure how to explain it. How could she put into words the fear of standing out, the comfort of being invisible? "I didn't think anyone would care," she finally said, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Grant's expression softened, and for a moment she seemed less like the strict teacher everyone feared and more like someone who genuinely wanted to understand. "Well," she said after a pause, "you were wrong about that." As the applause faded and the class returned to their seats, Alyssa realized that her world had shifted, whether she was ready for it or not. The rest of the class passed in a daze. Mrs. Grant attempted to continue the lesson, but the air in the room was different now, charged with a sense of awe and curiosity. Alyssa sat quietly at her desk, trying to disappear again, but the whispers from her classmates made it impossible. "That was insane," one boy muttered to his friend. "She's like a genius or something." "She made it look so easy," another girl whispered, sneaking a glance at Alyssa. "I didn't even know she could talk, let alone do that." Alyssa heard every word, her cheeks burning despite herself. She wasn't used to attention, let alone admiration. Part of her wanted to shrink back into her quiet corner, but another part, a small, growing part, felt something new, pride, validation. For once she wasn't being ignored. Mrs. Grant, meanwhile, couldn't stop glancing at Alyssa. She had prided herself on spotting hidden potential in her students, but she had missed this entirely. Alyssa's quiet brilliance had been right in front of her, and she hadn't seen it. That realization gnawed at her. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Mrs. Grant called out over the noise of students packing up their things. "Alyssa, can you stay for a moment?" The murmurs started again as the other students filed out, sneaking glances at Alyssa on their way. She stayed in her seat, clutching her notebook tightly as the last stragglers left the room. Mrs. Grant walked over, her usual commanding presence softened by something gentler. She sat on the edge of her desk and folded her arms, looking at Alyssa thoughtfully. "I owe you an apology," she began, her tone unusually sincere. Alyssa blinked, unsure of what to say. "An apology?" Mrs. Grant nodded. "I underestimated you. I assumed you were just coasting along, but I was wrong. You're extraordinary, Alyssa, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." The words hung in the air heavy with meaning. Alyssa wasn't sure how to respond. No teacher had ever spoken to her like this before, not as a student, but as a person. Mrs. Grant continued, her voice more confident now. "You have a gift, Alyssa, and it's not just about solving equations. It's about the way you think, the way you approach problems. That's something rare, and it's something you shouldn't hide." Alyssa looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the edges of her notebook. I didn't think it mattered." "It matters," Mrs. Grant said firmly. "It matters a lot. and I want to help you if you'll let me. There are programs, competitions, opportunities that could really challenge you and help you grow. I think you'd be amazing." Alyssa's heart raced. The idea of stepping out of her comfort zone, of embracing this part of herself, was terrifying, but it was also thrilling. She looked up at Mrs. Grant, seeing her not as the intimidating teacher she once feared, but as someone who genuinely believed in her. "I'll think about it," Alyssa said quietly, a small smile tugging at her lips. Mrs. Grant smiled back. "That's all I ask." But as Alyssa left the classroom, clutching her notebook tightly, she couldn't help but feel that something inside her had shifted. For the first time, she wondered not what she could hide, but what she could become. Alyssa walked down the hallway, her mind a swirl of thoughts. The murmur of students heading to their next classes faded into the background as she replayed the moment over and over, the chalk in her hand, the stunned silence, the applause. It all felt like a dream. For so long she had kept her talents hidden, unsure of how they would be received. But now, for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she didn't have to stay invisible. The rest of the day was a blur. Classmates approached her during lunch, some shyly asking how she'd done it, others simply congratulating her. It was strange being noticed, but it wasn't as scary as she thought it would be. If anything, it felt good. That evening, as Alyssa sat at the kitchen table with her parents, she hesitated before telling them what had happened. They were used to her quiet demeanor and often worried she wasn't reaching her potential. But when she shared the story, how Mrs. Grant had challenged her, how she'd solved the impossible equation, how the class had reacted, the pride on their faces was unmistakable. "You've always been capable of amazing things," her mom said, squeezing her hand. "I'm so glad the world is starting to see what we already know." Her dad chimed in, "This is just the beginning, Alyssa. Don't ever be afraid to show the world what you can do." That night, Alyssa opened her notebook and stared at the blank page in front of her. For once, it didn't feel like a space for secrets. It felt like a space for possibility. She picked up her pen and began writing, not just equations, but ideas, goals, dreams. What if she entered one of the competitions Mrs. Grant had mentioned? What if she didn't stop there? The thought both scared and excited her, but she knew one thing for sure: she didn't want to go back to hiding. Alyssa's story is more than just a moment of triumph in a classroom. It's a reminder that we all have untapped potential, talents waiting to be uncovered, and dreams waiting to be pursued. Too often people are underestimated by others, and sometimes even by themselves. But sometimes all it takes is one moment, one challenge, to reveal what's been there all along. Whether you're a student, a teacher, a parent, or just someone trying to navigate life, Alyssa's story is a call to action. Don't let fear or doubt hold you back. Don't let others define what you're capable of. And most importantly, never underestimate the power of stepping forward, even when it feels impossible. So, what's your hidden talent? What's that thing you've been keeping to yourself, afraid to show the world? Maybe it's time to take the first step, to grab the metaphorical chalk and write your own story. If you found Alyssa's story inspiring, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe for more stories like this. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to share more incredible tales with you. Thank you for watching, and remember, your potential is limitless. But as you close this video, take a moment to ask yourself, what's stopping you from showing the world what you can do? If you enjoyed this video and don't want to miss any inspiring stories or exciting moments like this one, don't forget to hit the like button and turn on the subscription bell. This way, you'll be the first to know when we upload a new video. Share this video with your friends and family because stories like Alyssa's deserve to be heard and inspire everyone. We work hard to bring you more amazing content, and your support means the world to us. Stay tuned for our next video, where we'll take you on another journey full of excitement and life lessons. Until then, stay curious and get ready to discover more. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon.